Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rodney Fong, President and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. For this webinar, we're partnering with a chamber member, Humu. Humu brings people and teams together. They help make behavioral changes powered by science and data, and we are excited to have them today. Remember, this is a pre-recorded webinar, so if you have any questions or want to learn more about Humu, visit them at humu.com. Today's recording is led by Humu's own CEO and co-founder, Laszlo Bock, and a member of Humu's science team, Leslie Caputo. They'll cover today's concerns and how to lead with empathy and resiliency. They will discuss shifting to remote working and the role leaders play during these times. So now I'll turn it over to Laszlo and Leslie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laszlo Bock. Can you chime up in the Q&A if folks can hear me and see me all right? Let's see.
Looks like you're good.
Okay, terrific. Thanks. We will dive in. I am the CEO and co-founder of Humu and the author of a book called Work Rules. Before founding Humu, I was the Senior Vice President of People Operations at Google for about 10 years. And what that means is today is the first day in about 15 years that I've worn a suit to work. And the reason for the suit is one of the things we decided to do at Humu while folks are distributed and working remotely was at our bi-weekly All Fins, our All Hands meeting. We call it All Fins because everything's got to be fish themed. We decided to do Black Tie Wednesdays. So this is my black tie. So I hope many of you are dressed up appropriately as well. I also want to answer what's going on with the fish behind me and behind my colleague, Leslie Caputo. The fish is actually a humu, which is the Hawaiian fish that our company's named after. It's short for humu humu, nuku nuku, apu a'a. And humu in Hawaiian means to sew or to stitch. And it's also known as the patchwork fish. And the idea is it looks like it's a bunch of different pieces of different fish knit together. Just like what we try to do at Humu is bring people and teams and companies together. So what we do at Humu is we nudge people towards better work habits, unlocking the potential of individuals, teams, and organizations. Our nudges are precise, personalized coaching moments delivered to people in the moments that matter the most. We're hosting this webinar as part of our mission to make work better for everyone, everywhere. And in light of COVID-19 spreading across the globe, organizations are implementing unprecedented shifts in how they work. Over the past few weeks, our partners have been asking us how to best take care of their people and work in a distributed way. And we're guessing many of you have similar questions. So we've pulled together some of the most common concerns we've heard over the past few weeks, and we'll be sharing tips for how to address those in our conversation today. Before we get started, I also want to call attention to the modified nudges that we're providing to anybody who wants them. Each nudge will contain a short, scientifically backed suggestion to help you work better from home or support those who can't and navigate this uncertainty. And you can sign up for those free of charge at humu.com/remote-nudges, or there's a link off our homepage. And that's just for anybody who needs them. We're just trying to do our little part to help. So I've asked Leslie Caputo, who's one of our people scientists, to join me. She's an organizational psychologist, and she spent her entire career and life training for this moment. Most of her career has been in consulting, working with large enterprises on people challenges. And most recently, she was actually the chief customer officer of a company called Work that focuses exclusively on workplace flexibility, remote work arrangements, distributed teams. So she's worked with hundreds of companies on how to make remote work work. And she's got some great ideas and tips to share with you all today. So here's a quick look at what we're going to cover. I'm going to ask Leslie some of the most common questions we've heard on remote work. And then Leslie's going to turn the tables on me for a few questions that we've been getting on leading through times like this more generally. You should feel free to throw in questions on the chat. We'll be monitoring that throughout, and we'll follow up after the webinar with answers to those questions. And then at the end, we'll also share some resources that we have to share with everybody. So with that, Leslie, are you ready to dive in?
I'm ready.
Terrific. In just a few weeks, Leslie, we've gone from a small fraction of the workforce working remotely to the vast majority working remotely. What do people need to know as we navigate this unprecedented shift?
Yeah, so obviously this is a major change and it goes well above and beyond kind of the more general transition to a remote workforce. It's introduced tremendous amount of stress into the system. There are people who aren't just working remotely, but are also providing care for their children and homeschooling. So there's a lot that's new to this equation. I spoke to a manager the other day of a major financial services firm, and what he said to me today is, I feel, and our people feel like we've lost one of our five senses. You know, we're not able to be around and see what managers are doing, get the general feel from employees of how they're feeling. We just feel like we're flying so blind, and how do we adjust to this? And I really empathize with that. And I think it makes a lot of sense, especially when you're a company that hasn't worked remotely or had a large amount of your population work remotely before. It's a really stark contrast. So one of my favorite pieces of research that's out there about remote teams is some work done by Dr. Karen Sobel-Lojewski, and she has spent her entire career studying the impact that technology has on people. And she's developed this really cool framework that talks about the different types of virtual distance. So there's three types in her framework. There's physical distance, operational distance, and affinity distance. So physical distance has to do with exactly what it sounds like, time and place. You're working with colleagues in different time zones or across different geographies. And what she found is that that actually has the least impact on performance, productivity, innovation. So that doesn't make a big difference. The next one is operational distance, and that's sort of just the stuff that gets in the way. So think bad VC connection, or you send an email about something that really probably warranted a face-to-face chat, and the message just gets lost in virtual translation, and there's all sorts of downward impacts from that. So you want to reduce operational distance as much as possible, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. But it also is not the type of distance that has the greatest impact on teams' performance and productivity. It's really the third one, which is about affinity distance. And affinity distance really has to do with the strength of the relationships, the level of interdependence or shared goals amongst team members, and trust. And that's the one that her research has found has the biggest impact on how well a team does, how productive they are, and how able they are to collaborate and innovate. So all that to say, if there's one thing that I want people to walk away from today with, is an understanding that, yes, this is hard, and operationally it's incredibly hard, but if you just spend your time focusing on making sure people are still having meaningful connections and trust one another and are there for one another and treat each other with kindness, the rest is blocking and tackling. So that's really the biggest message, I would say.
So that's actually really interesting, because a lot of what I've read and seen talks about the logistics, what you're calling kind of the operational piece. Is my remote viewing software working? Can people hear me? You're saying the most important and hardest piece is this affinity piece and staying connected. How do people do that when they're distributing?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The key is to be more deliberate about it. So when you all are in an office together, or at least core people of your team are in an office together, right? Many companies have people across different offices, but you typically have coworkers around. There's all of these opportunities for spontaneous collisions, as some people call it, or connections, right? You go to get a glass of water, or you go to get a coffee, and you run into someone, and you have that time to just chat and connect on the personal level, or maybe collaborate or coordinate on something that you didn't realize you both had in common related to a project or a work task. When you're working remotely and in a distributed way, you don't have those same opportunities. So your calendar just gets full with meetings that are all project and task based, and you go from meeting to meeting to meeting without much time to really forge those personal connections. And so what teams need to do in this new reality that we're all in now is schedule those things more deliberately. So a couple examples of what companies can do. You can set up a recurring VC that's sort of always living on the link of people's calendars. Here at Humu, we call it our infinite hangout. So it's a link to a VC that anyone can pop into at any time. There is no agenda or kind of set expectations for that meeting, other than it's for colleagues to come together, share, and connect on how they're doing and just chat. We also have what we call our chat roulette bot, which is a much more tech-enabled solution. Other companies don't need to do this, but it's a bot that matchmakes you with different coworkers so that you can have a one-to-one. And it allows you also to get to know other people in the organization. We're growing really quickly, so it's really important for us to make sure we're always getting to know each other. So those are two sort of more tech-enabled ways, but it doesn't need to be that advanced. It can be as simple as putting additional one-to-one time on the calendar with your coworkers. Spending or dedicating the first 3 minutes of every single meeting to just catching up with one another and really holding yourselves accountable to that norm, or just checking in with people via Slack or whatever chat tool you use. The key is an open space. It's not about work. It's about connecting personally, and you do it with greater intention and in a more deliberate way.
Perfect. And I'd love to double click on that and ask more about collaboration and innovation. I know there have been a bunch of questions in the chat about who the researcher was that you referenced a bit earlier. Can you just repeat that person's name for the folks?
Yeah, Karen Sobel-Lojeski. So we can actually link out to some of her research as a follow-up.
Terrific. Okay. Well, so diving back in, I think the great fear companies have when workers are remote, and the reason most companies haven't done this is people are going to slack off, they're not going to collaborate, innovation will fall to zero. If you look at places like Lockheed Martin, they had a skunk works famously where they put people together. Bell Labs, the whole notion 50 years ago was casual collisions. We did a lot of that at Google as well. In fact, at Humu, one of the things we found in working with our customers is that about a day and a half a week from home is kind of the optimal amount of work from home in normal times. So there's a lot of fear around collaboration, innovation, and losing that. What's your advice about how can companies, based on the years of research you've done and the work you've done in this, how can companies make sure that people still are collaborating and that innovation is actually happening, even in today's setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was always, in all the work that I've done around this, the number one point of concern or anxiety that I heard from business leaders, from managers around the implications of allowing more people to work remote. But for the exact reason that you just mentioned, that optimal work period of work from home, work in the office, there's a really awesome study out there about a concept called burstiness. So it's by two scientists, Christoph Reidel and Anita Woolley. We can actually also link this to you all. They did a field experiment with remote teams.
And sorry to interrupt. I know people will ask, can you say the names again slowly?
Yeah, Christoph Reidel and Anita Woolley.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. So they did a field experiment on remote teams, and they wanted to understand what are the conditions on which remote teams are the most innovative and produce the best results. And what they found was that it was something called temporal burstiness, like a burst. And what that meant was that people would go away, work independently, focus, heads down work, but then quickly come together into these bursts of activity where there would be rapid exchanging of ideas, a lot of diversity of thought. And keep in mind, this is all in a remote context. And then they would take those insights, learnings, aha moments, and then go back and work more independently to reflect. And so what that looks like is you actually see bursts all over the workplace now. If you ever send an email, you kind of turn to get a cup of coffee, you turn back, and all of a sudden there's 20 responses in an email thread with a million ideas, or maybe in Slack, you see everyone piling on with comments. That's technically a burst in a remote setting. And so the key for companies who want to make sure that this collaboration and innovation is happening is by celebrating both of those moments, allowing people to have the space to block out their calendars, put their head down and do the work. That's really an opportunity in working remotely. But also when you do see those bursts, making sure that you're contributing, you're chiming in, you're celebrating the fact that people are so engaged. And if you don't see those bursts happening, then you want to create intentional space to do it. So if you feel like maybe we're leading too far on the heads down work side and I don't feel like people are getting together and exchange ideas, set up a time for people to come together and share what they've learned or share what they're working on and have that richness and diversity of information transfer. So that's really, really key. And it also really translates into what you said, Laszlo, about the optimal work from home time. That is in kind of building bursts in by design, where people are using the time when they're at home to reflect and do the heads down work, but then when they get into the office, they're collaborating and having those bursts. So it's something for folks here to keep in mind that when we're through all of this, you might think about how you use remote work more deliberately and maybe do have that optimal period of working from home that's anywhere from 1 to 2 days, so that office time can be the bursty time.
You're almost saying some learnings might come of this. Something,
yes.
Work might change a little bit from what we're learning.
Yes, absolutely.
What about, I really appreciate the very practical things you're suggesting, like, given that we now know about burstiness, if you're not feeling a lot of innovation, like schedule time for people to kind of riff on ideas and kind of, compare notes and move quickly and generate some ideas and bounce off one another. What are some other really practical tips you have for companies that now find themselves massively distributed in a way they weren't before?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think one of the things I always tell companies is that there's really no silver bullet to doing remote work well. It's about doing all of the things that make for effective work habits today, but doing them better and with greater discipline. So what immediately comes to mind is communication, right? All of the communication practices that we know make for effective work need to be done with greater discipline. Things like have clear communication norms with your team. Things like, what is end of day? Simple things. What does end of day mean in this remote context? We don't know what time people are working, when they're unplugging, right? So being clear, what does end of day mean? When do we communicate what our hours are that we're open to having meetings? When we do need our, heads down work, how do we indicate that on our calendars? Things like that. What's the best way to get in touch with each other? What are the best communication mediums, and how do we map those to messages? So as I mentioned earlier, part of that operational distance piece is that people oftentimes struggle with what's the right way to relay important information if I can't see you face to face. So you can actually set norms about that in your team that, hey, if something's really complex or interpersonally sensitive, you've got to be on a VC to actually see each other and be able to interpret body language. If something is incredibly important, please put it in an email. Let's not put it in Slack or chat where it's going to get lost. So setting those clear bounds and parameters is really, really important. And then all of the basics, like have agendas, take action items. It seems simple, but if it's not done in a remote context, things really, really fall apart. The other one from a communication piece, I'd say, is aligning on outcomes. So when you're not able to actually see each other in the office, you can very quickly start to wonder, like, well, what are these people doing? What are those people doing? So being really crystal clear about what you expect as a result of a project and how you're going to update each other along the way reduces a lot of the anxiety that comes without being able to see progress. And then the last thing I'll say is really tactically, along with that operational distance piece, is thinking about the resources your people need. I had a manager tell me yesterday, it seems simple, but in all my one-to-ones this week, I said to each team member, what's the one thing that you need to work more productively at home, and how can I support you in getting it? And it was really simple things like, I just need a better laptop stand, or I don't have a dedicated desk and maybe I can figure out how to do that. And he just sort of coached them through those things. So that's a really easy tip that managers today could just have in their one-to-ones to start these conversations now more tactically.
Love it. And it's striking how so many of the things you're describing are things we know we should be doing. And they're just small little things that add up to a dramatic difference in what it's like to be distributed. That's on the company side. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the individuals. What about people who personally are struggling either to find focus or to be productive when they're outside their traditional environment, when they've got kind of noise and chaos from their household, or people who are just unsettled and probably, like all of us, a little freaked out?
Yeah. So I think the reality is that this is a really difficult time, and people are going to be distracted and they're going to be stressed. And as I said before, a lot of people aren't just trying to do their jobs. They're trying to take care of children, homeschool children, take care of other loved ones that they're worried about. So I think I would say mostly people just need to be kind to each other right now and really support each other to the best of our ability. And we need to focus on our well-being. So things that I would encourage all people to do, and I would encourage managers to think about underscoring the importance of this to their team members, like taking breaks, actually setting time to take breaks, getting fresh air if you can, actually making time to eat lunch. Those things are really, really important right now, as well as knowing when it's time to unplug. So despite all the stereotypes that exist around remote workers being in their pajamas all day, right? What the research actually shows is that one of the most common challenges for remote workers is knowing when to unplug, because you don't have those clear boundaries. And so you need to really understand, when am I going to unplug? How am I going to communicate to my team? Back to that idea of setting norms before, when I'm offline for the day, and maybe considering putting your devices away. So right now, especially given how different this situation is, really focusing on your own well-being. And then the other part of that is that people do feel really stressed right now about still trying to be productive at work. And some people feel even more productive when they're working from home, and others, to your point, Laszlo, really struggle without kind of the conventional structure of an office environment. So for those who are in that second bucket, struggling with how to be productive without that structure, I would say try to deliberately build some of that structure in. So either every morning as you're starting your day, or the night before, thinking about what are the big ticket items I need to get done, and grouping them into themes. So we talked about how important the connection piece is. What are the 3 people that I really need to connect with from a relational standpoint and really build rapport with today? What are the 3 people or 3 projects that I need to do some sort of coordination around? And what are the 3 things that I need to heads down do work around? And blocking it out into those chunks so that we really understand what are the most impactful things that I can do.
Anything else that people should be thinking about or doing right now?
Yeah, you mentioned it earlier that there might be some learnings coming out of this. So what I would really urge people to think about is right now, this is really hard and we're all just trying to get through it. And as I said before, this is not a typical remote environment by any stretch of the imagination. But when we're through on the other side, I would really encourage people to think about what they learned from this experiment. Some people are saying this is a very large experiment in many ways, and think about what the opportunities are. So right now, the vast majority of us are working from home as sort of a backup plan, right? And to protect our health. But there's so many ways that you can actually use remote work as a people strategy. It has tremendous impact on the quality of talent you can attract. If you can hire remote workers, you can get the best talent from anywhere. It has a tremendous impact on diversity, particularly around gender diversity. Of the 30% of women who drop out of the workforce after having a child, 70% say they would have stayed in if they had more access to flexibility. There's a lot of data out there around how offering remote work can benefit certain underrepresented minorities. So from a D&I perspective, I really encourage companies to think about this. And also from overall effectiveness. So we talked about the fact that you might be able to optimize around what's the right balance of working from home and working in the office to create those bursts that really enable collaboration and innovation. So as stressful as it might be, take a few minutes every day to reflect on what worked well, what was really challenging, and what this could look like once we're all back to some semblance of normalcy.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So with that, I would love to turn the tables on you, Laszlo, because I think those were questions that we got from many of our customers, partners around what they're struggling with remote work. But this is also in many ways also a leadership challenge, right? And I think particularly folks are wondering, what is the role of the leader in this time? So that's my first question for you is, given everything that's going on and in your role as a founder and a CEO and from your prior experiences, what do you feel like is the biggest thing for leaders right now? What is their role in all of this?
I think there's three things leaders should be focused on right now in terms of how they lead and how they show up. The first is being calm. It's really, really critical to convey calm and confidence, even in a chaotic environment. The people on your teams are looking for a source of stability, a source of reassurance. Doesn't mean you have to have all the answers, but you can't look panicked, you can't look freaked out, even if you are deep inside, number one. So conveying calm. Number two, clarity is really important. It's okay if you don't have all the answers to say, I don't know, I don't have all the answers. I will update you tomorrow. We'll know more in a week. A lot of companies are under tremendous financial pressure, particularly smaller ones. And it's totally fine to tell employees, I don't actually know, we'll have a better answer in a week, in 2 days, however long. That's better than telling people things are fine or being panicked about it. So number one, conveying some calm. And the second is clarity. And the third is compassion. You have to remember, no matter what's going on, one of the jobs of leaders, the reason you are all leaders is you get the bigger paychecks, you got to have the bigger shoulders. And people are looking for you as a source of stability and insight and care that they may not be able to get from other places. So calm, clarity, and compassion go a tremendous way. And the people and managers who are able to show those traits will differentiate themselves and show themselves as people to turn to, people others will follow. And you actually have a real chance and responsibility to do some good by working in that way with the folks around you.
That's great. And so I think hopefully everyone agrees that the role is really to have those bigger shoulders and to create that sense of calm and stability. And also leaders feel the pressure of running a business, right? And managing a team. So what advice would you give for how to strike the right balance between keeping people productive? And we talked about some of those things, but also being empathetic at the same time.
Well, one other thought on the leader side is you also need to remember to take care of yourself. And so you need an outlet that is not your coworkers to look for support. This is not a time to be going to people on your team who report to you and dumping stuff on them and looking for support. Your job is to support them, which means you need to find a source of support, whether it's your peers, whether it's your boss, whether it's people in your social circle. So you need to do that in order to fuel yourself so that you can provide that calm and clarity and compassion. Regarding your question about the balance between keeping people productive and maintaining empathy empathy has to come first. Basically, people who are freaked out are not going to be productive. They're just not. And so you have to start from a point of releasing your agenda and just saying, how are you, and checking in every day. So at Humu, we went from having a daily stand-up where the whole company connects a couple times a week. We do it every day just so we can check out. We actually set a norm inside the company that now that everyone's at home, if you have a kid come into your video screen, if you have a pet come into your video screen, if you have to get up and run and answer the door because there's a UPS delivery person there, that's normal. No one's allowed to apologize for that. No one's expected to. And that's coming from a place of empathy, from how can we actually meet people where they are and make what everyone's going through normal and understood, so that we can get on then with being productive once everyone's feeling a little better.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because we all know that the circumstances are unique and that there are dogs barking and kids coming into the room, but to have it role modeled and to have someone, a leader, explicitly state at the start of a meeting, that's okay, we know this is going to happen, it brings the whole level of anxiety down. So I think that's really, really important. So we're just about at time. Any other thoughts on that piece before we get into some of our resources of how to support folks in this?
Yeah, just kind of a final thought and maybe message, if I may, before we wrap. You know, one of the things that's funny about doing startups is if you're over 40, you're one of the older people on the team. And one of the virtues of being one of the older people on the team is, without taking anything away from what we're going through now, you've lived personally through some pretty messed up things. So, you know, I remember the Iran hostage crisis in the 1970s. I grew up with the Cold War. I remember volunteering in the early 1990s to counsel people who had AIDS at the time when it was this mysterious, terrifying death sentence. I remember being just outside Manhattan on September 11th, 2001. I remember Hurricane Katrina. I live in California, so of course we have the 4 seasons of fire, mudslide, you know, riot, and you know, all the crises we seem to have in California due to the environment, and earthquake is the last one. We're going to get through all of this. We will get through as communities, as cities, as nations, as a species. We'll get through it as long as we show up as our best selves, as long as we care for ourselves and the people around us. And a lot of that are very small things. And, you know, it's no wonder we started the company we did, focused on small actions, but it's things like shopping for your neighbors, which my wife has been doing. It's things like ordering takeout just so that you can support and put a little money back into these businesses that are really struggling. It's things like making time to check in with folks, whether they're your parents or friends or people you work with that you normally wouldn't check in on, or even people you used to work with that you haven't checked in on in a long time. That small outreach and saying, are you doing okay? How are you? That listening will go a long way. So we'll get through this, and it's hard and painful, but you know, things will get better and less panicky, and things will return to normal. And eventually, hopefully, we'll have learned a lot about how to better work together and how to better see the human on the other side of the phone, the VC, or across the hallway. So with that, I want to close out with, I promised, some resources. And like I said, we'll follow up with folks who had questions on the chat. But we're here to help. There's a few practical ways that we're helping our partners right now. And some of them we've opened up to companies we're not working with, and some we've opened up to anyone in the world. So the first, the nudges for all, free remote nudges that are related to work and well-being for anybody who wants them. And that's just us giving away what we're doing because we think it's the right thing and we know we can be helpful. Second, we've actually designed a new resilience module related to what people are going through now. So if you want to learn more about how Humu is supporting our partners now on our Nudge Engine platform, feel free to reach out to resilience.webinar@humu.com. We've also got a new blog spot up about leading through crisis, and we'll link to that in the follow-up emails that you receive, along with a recording for today's session if you want more advice and tips and resources. And if you're interested in learning more about any of this, drop a note to resilience.webinar@humu.com. On behalf of Leslie and myself, I want to thank all of you for spending 30 minutes out of your day to chat with us on these important topics. We really, really hope you found it helpful. Feedback would be welcome, and everybody take care of one another and stay healthy.
Thank you, Humu. This webinar is a two-part series from our friends at Humu. Part 2 will focus on why resiliency beats contingency planning every time. The San Francisco Chamber of Commerce will continue to provide online resources on a weekly basis, so stay tuned. And don't forget to follow us online at sfchamber.com and all of our social media outlets. So please have a good day.